A laugh echoed across the boardroom. Someone had just mocked Keanu Reeves' mother's accent. The room froze. Keanu stood, eyes locked on the man. What he said next would not only silence everyone, it would spark a moment the world would never forget. But before he spoke, decades of pain came rushing back. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The conference room smelled faintly of roasted coffee and new leather. Long panes of glass framed a view of Los Angeles below, sun-scorched and shimmering. Inside, the room pulsed with that peculiar kind of silence that only happens before a major decision is made, one that could shape a streaming giant's next global hit. Keanu Reeves sat near the end of the massive oak table, dressed in a plain dark shirt, his posture relaxed but attentive. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He never was. But when he was invited to help produce a docu-series on immigrant voices, he hadn't hesitated. He knew exactly who he wanted to bring with him that day. His mother, Patricia Taylor, sat beside him. She wore a modest cream sweater and a pair of gold-framed glasses that slipped low on her nose as she scanned the documents in front of her. A former costume designer, Patricia had spent her life helping others look their best while keeping herself in the background. Her voice was gentle, lined with the graceful rhythm of a Portuguese accent that decades in Canada and the US had never quite erased. When the lead creative executive asked for feedback on the pitch's visual tone, Patricia leaned forward to speak. "I think the camera should move soft, like memory, not too sharp or fast." There was a slight pause. Her words weren't rushed. Her pronunciation of think carried a softness that she didn't bother correcting. Then it happened. A chuckle, short, clipped, and careless. It came from a young man 2 seats down, a junior producer with gel-slacked hair and a barely concealed smirk. He didn't say anything outright, just laughed under his breath and shook his head, as if reacting to something beneath notice. But it was loud enough to cut through the room. Patricia blinked, lips tightening just a fraction. She didn't look at the man. She simply glanced back at her notes, pretending not to hear. But Keanu heard. So did everyone else. The temperature in the room shifted. What had felt like a casual, creative brainstorming session now grew tense, heavier by the second. A few of the executives exchanged quick glances. Some looked at the ceiling. One woman started scribbling in her notebook with renewed focus, her ears burning red. Keanu didn't move at first. He didn't speak. His hand rested calmly on the edge of the table, fingers tapping a slow, measured rhythm. Then, without a word, he turned his head toward the man who had laughed. The young producer froze, caught mid-smirk, his eyes meeting Keanu's. Whatever amusement he had been entertaining vanished instantly. Keanu didn't glare. He just looked. And in that look was something colder than anger. It was the kind of look that asked a question without words. A look that pulled the air out of the room and demanded silence. And silence it got. The kind of silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was transformative. 1 second ago, this was a room full of professionals, floating comfortably on their reputations and ideas. Now, it felt like they'd all been dropped into a place where every breath mattered. Keanu leaned back slightly, still staring at the producer. His voice hadn't entered the room yet, but his presence filled every inch of it. The others waited. Someone coughed into their sleeve. Another person nervously adjusted their glasses. Still, no one broke the silence. Patricia didn't speak again. She shifted in her chair with quiet dignity, her hands folded neatly on the table. If she was hurt, she didn't show it. That made it worse. Keanu finally spoke. Not loud, not dramatic. Just 5 words, low and calm. "Would you repeat that laugh?" The question dropped like a stone in a still pond. Every eye turned to the young producer, who looked like he wanted to vanish into his chair. I wasn't... I didn't mean... The man stammered. I didn't ask what you meant, Keanu said, his voice still calm. I asked you to repeat it. The producer looked around for help, but none came. One of the senior executives cleared her throat and looked down. Another slowly slid his coffee mug out of the line of fire. Sir, I think, the producer began again. Keanu didn't blink. Because if you're going to laugh at the way my mother speaks, I'd like you to be brave enough to do it twice, loud enough for all of us to hear it this time. The producer sat frozen. A pale sweat began to form at his temple. No one moved. No one spoke. The windows still glowed with sun, but inside, the temperature had dropped again. For Patricia, it wasn't about revenge. She didn't even look up. But Keanu wasn't done, because this moment wasn't about just one snicker. This was about 100 small humiliations he had witnessed over the course of his life. Too many moments when people like his mother were told, subtly, quietly, that their voice didn't belong. He turned his gaze toward the center of the table, not singling anyone out, but making sure everyone was included. Let's get something clear, Keanu said. If this project is really about honoring immigrant voices, then it better start in this room. That means listening when people speak differently than you. It means respecting the story behind the accent. And it means we don't laugh when someone brave enough to show up offers a piece of herself. No one dared argue. Across the table, the producer slowly lowered his eyes, his jaw clenched but silent now. In that moment, Keanu wasn't an actor or a celebrity. He was a son, and the room would never forget it. The creative director finally cleared his throat and tried to redirect the meeting, but the tone had changed. Gone was the easy rhythm of networking and production talk. In its place was something quieter, more cautious, an unspoken understanding that they had all just witnessed something intimate and deeply human. Keanu gently placed his hand over his mother's. She looked at him with soft eyes, the way mothers do when they're both proud and a little heartbroken that their children have to defend them. Patricia didn't say anything, but she gave the smallest nod. That was enough. The rest of the meeting continued, but no one forgot what had happened. Every suggestion that followed came with a little more thoughtfulness, a little more humility. When Patricia spoke again, this time about using color and warmth to reflect cultural memory, people listened more carefully. No one interrupted, no one smiled at the wrong time. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the skyline, casting golden rays across the glass walls. But inside that conference room, something brighter had happened. A mother had been seen, a son had stood tall, and a room full of professionals had been reminded why stories like the one they were planning to tell mattered. As the meeting wrapped up, the lead producer stood and thanked everyone. People began to gather their laptops and notes. Keanu remained seated for a moment longer, his hand still resting on the table. The young producer, who had laughed earlier, kept his head down and exited quickly, avoiding eye contact. Patricia stood and reached for her tote bag. As she did, Keanu finally looked up again, watching the others shuffle out. He didn't need to say anything else. He had said enough. But just as he and his mother reached the hallway, one of the senior executives caught up with them. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else heard, "I just wanted to say thank you. That needed to be said, and you said it with more grace than most of us would have managed." Keanu gave a small, quiet smile. "We all have someone we're showing up for," he said. "Today, it was her." The executive nodded, her eyes a little wet. As they stepped into the elevator, Patricia gave his arm a squeeze. "I'm glad you didn't punch him," she said gently. Keanu chuckled. "So am I." But what he didn't say, and what would stay with everyone who had witnessed that moment, was that sometimes the loudest silence comes from standing up, not lashing out. And this time, the whole room had heard it. The elevator doors had barely closed when Keanu's eyes drifted to the floor. Something in the silence between him and his mother tugged at an old place, one he didn't visit often, not because he couldn't, but because it always arrived so clearly without invitation. Lisbon, 1974. He had been just 10 years old, legs swinging off a cracked plastic chair in a downtown bank, while his mother stood at the counter, clutching a manila folder of documents, her red scarf, his favorite, wrapped loosely around her neck. It was early spring, but the air still held the bite of winter along the river. The marble floors of the bank were cold under his shoes. Everything smelled like dust and ink. The adults behind the glass counter looked important, too important to notice the small boy with the black hair and large, curious eyes. But Keanu noticed everything. He watched his mother smile politely at the teller. She handed over her Canadian ID, carefully explaining that she had just relocated and needed to open a checking account. Her accent, melodic and touched with Lisbon's old tones, rolled gently over her English. The teller looked down at the documents, then up again. His expression tightened. "Do you even know how this works?" the man asked, not kindly. Keanu blinked. He didn't understand what the man meant. His mother clearly knew what she was doing. She had filled out the forms so carefully the night before, double-checking every box twice. "I believe I do," Patricia answered, her tone calm. "I've opened accounts before." The teller didn't look convinced. He sighed loudly and turned to his colleague, whispering something behind his hand. Keanu didn't catch the words, but he saw the look that followed. The colleague stifled a grin. They both laughed under their breath. His mother noticed too. Keanu's fingers curled around the edge of the chair. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. All he knew was that something wrong had just happened, something that made his stomach feel tight and his chest hot. Patricia adjusted her scarf, pulled her shoulders back, and said, "Would it help if I brought a translator tomorrow?" "No," the man muttered. "Just forget it. We'll set it up. Wait there." He walked away, leaving her standing at the counter. Alone, unwelcome, but unshaken. She turned to Keanu then and offered the same kind of smile she always did when he scraped his knee or dropped a glass, gentle, practiced, and kind. "Are you okay?" she asked him softly. "I'm fine," he whispered. "But they were rude." "Yes," she said, sitting beside him. They were. The bank's harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the polished marble floor as they sat there. Keanu looked at his mother, waiting for her to be angry, to say something about the man behind the counter, to call it what it was. But she didn't. Instead, Patricia reached into her handbag and pulled out a napkin-wrapped sandwich, handing it to Keanu with a wink. "I know it's not peanut butter, but it's still good." Keanu nodded, but his appetite was gone. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Why did he laugh at you?" Patricia looked down at the scarf in her lap, smoothing a small wrinkle with her fingers. "Sometimes, people don't know what to do with voices that don't sound like theirs." "But that's not fair," Keanu said, a touch of heat in his voice. "No, it isn't," she said, her gaze soft but steady. "But people will always hear your voice before your heart, so make sure your voice has strength." Keanu absorbed her words in silence. At 10 years old, he didn't fully understand them, but the weight of them stayed with him, etched into his bones. That lesson didn't vanish when they left the bank, nor when they stopped at the bakery on the way home. It echoed every time someone tilted their head at his mother's accent or rushed to interrupt her sentences. It wasn't just the sound of her voice they judged. It was her identity, her history, her home, all compressed into a few syllables that sounded other. Later that evening, Keanu sat on the floor of their modest apartment, tracing the stitching on his mother's red scarf. She had taken it off and draped it over the back of a kitchen chair. To him, it had always felt like armor, a bright defiance against gray days. He didn't know then how much she had endured behind that fabric. But he remembered the color, vivid, unyielding. "Will you always talk like that?" he had asked as she finished the dishes. Patricia turned to him, drying her hands. "Like what?" The sounds, the accent. She paused for a moment, then crouched down in front of him. "It's part of me. Like your eyes are part of you. Like the way you laugh. I could change it, but I won't. Even if people make fun, especially then." She kissed his forehead and wrapped the red scarf around his shoulders like a cape. "This voice carried me through wars, borders, and 2 countries. I'm not hiding it." He nodded slowly. That night he asked to sleep, with the scarf beside him. She let him. Years later, long after they had left Portugal, Keanu still remembered that day at the bank more clearly than most birthdays. The sound of the clerk's snicker, the way his mother's lips pressed together in silence, the way she never raised her voice, but somehow stood taller than anyone else in the room. As a teenager in Toronto, he kept that red scarf in the top drawer of his desk, folded carefully. It traveled with him from apartment to apartment, tucked into bags, kept close. It wasn't just cloth, it was memory. It was the color of dignity, the color of resistance. Whenever he heard someone being mocked for how they spoke, the image of his mother's steady gaze returned. Her words, spoken decades earlier, always found their way back to him. "People will always hear your voice before your heart. Make sure your voice has strength." And so, when classmates laughed at an immigrant teacher's thick accent in school, Keanu had quietly confronted them, not with fists, but with that same measured tone his mother had taught him. When a friend's father once joked about someone needing subtitles, Keanu had left the table and never returned. He learned to recognize the subtle forms of dismissal. The smile that lasted just a second too long, the joke passed off as humor, the compliment with a hidden edge. And each time, the red scarf came to mind. Not just a reminder of his mother, but of what it meant to hold on to one's identity without apology. As his own career began to take shape, first in theater, then on camera, Keanu noticed something strange. The very people who praised authenticity often shied away from voices that didn't conform. Producers would ask for neutral accents. Agents advised him to soften certain vowels when reading scripts. But Keanu refused to imitate what they expected. He had learned that the cost of fitting in was often too high. And behind every choice he made there was Patricia. Her warmth, her silence in the face of cruelty, her refusal to dim her voice for anyone. Now, decades later, sitting in that Netflix conference room beside her once more, Keanu could feel the echo of that Lisbon bank, the same air of quiet judgment, the same ignorant smirk. But this time, he was no longer a child sitting on a worn wooden bench. He was the one with the power to speak. And the room was about to learn what strength really sounded like. The wind coming off Lake Ontario bit harder than usual that day. Slush clung to the sidewalks in thick gray patches, and the smell of exhaust from crowded streetcars lingered in the air. Keanu, now a lanky teenager navigating the icy streets of Toronto in hand-me-down boots, walked beside his mother, with a grocery bag in each hand. Patricia's coat was worn at the sleeves, her gloves were mismatched, one red and one navy, but she didn't seem to mind. They had just come from her second job, a weekend office cleaning gig she picked up after her full-time shift at the community hospital. Her shoes were soaked, and her scarf, a faded yellow one embroidered with birds, flapped against the wind. Keanu offered to carry her purse too, but she shook her head gently and smiled. They passed a bus stop where posters for voice training schools were plastered over the shelter glass. One caught Patricia's eye. Accent reduction. Speak clearly, get hired. She paused for a beat, her smile fading just slightly, then turned away without a word. Later that night, as snow whispered against the apartment windows, Keanu sat on the floor of their small living room, sketching in an old notebook. The heat was unreliable that winter, and he wore 2 sweaters. Patricia was in the bathroom, door slightly ajar. Keanu could hear the water running and her voice, soft, careful, deliberate. 3, through, thought. 30. Each word came with a pause, then a repeat, slower and more precise. 3, through, 30. He set his pencil down. The radio was off. The TV was silent. The only sound in their 2-bedroom apartment was his mother practicing the sounds of a language she already knew but was being forced to perfect. On the edge of the sink sat a small cassette player. A tape inside clicked and whirred, stopping every 10 seconds to leave room for repetition. On the mirror, in dry erase marker, she had written difficult phrases. Customer service. Appointment confirmation. Can I assist you? All circled, underlined, and marked phonetically. Her reflection mouthed them over and over. Keanu watched her from the hallway, unseen. The same woman who used to tell him bedtime stories in Portuguese with musical lilts and gentle vowels now bent over pronunciation guides like a student desperate to pass a final exam. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right, but it was their reality, and she never once complained. She never told him about the job interview that afternoon, where a receptionist asked her to speak slower for clarity 3 separate times. She didn't mention how the manager had leaned over the desk and said, "We love your resume, but some of our customers might find your English hard to follow." Instead, she had smiled, thanked them for the opportunity, and walked out with her head held high. Keanu only knew because he had been waiting by the front doors when she came out, her expression unreadable, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The next morning, before sunrise, Patricia was already dressed. A pale blue blouse and gray skirt hung awkwardly on her thin frame, the result of a recent weight loss she didn't talk about. Keanu stirred in the kitchen, pouring her tea. She reached for her briefcase and hesitated, then went back to the bathroom. He followed quietly and saw her fix her hair in the mirror, then pull out the same small tape recorder from the night before. This time she pressed play, and a slow, instructional voice began. Say, "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Patricia repeated it, twice. Say, "Please hold while I transfer your call." Again, slower. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But her eyes lingered on her own reflection, longer than usual, as if asking herself silently whether she would ever be enough in this new world. Keanu stood there silently, unable to move, heart tightening with a helplessness he didn't yet have the words to name. What kind of country required a woman like her? A woman who had stitched theater costumes for international stages, who had built a life from nothing, to rehearse basic greetings just to be seen? He found her pronunciation book on the counter. It was marked in red ink, with dog-eared pages and notes like "stress second syllable" or "do not drop final." As he flipped through it, he realized she had gone through almost the entire thing in the last 2 weeks. At school that day, Keanu couldn't focus. His English teacher asked about his homework, and he mumbled something vague. In the cafeteria, a boy from his history class mimicked a Brazilian accent for laughs, repeating a line from a movie, "You want the coffee or no?" The others laughed. Keanu did not. Later that evening, Patricia came home with another rejection, this time from a front desk position at a dental clinic. She didn't explain why. She just said, "It's okay, I'll keep trying." Then she reheated soup, folded the laundry, and asked Keanu about his school day like everything was normal. But he knew. That night, as she sat reading at the dining table, Keanu retrieved her tape recorder from the bathroom and brought it to her. "You don't have to do this, Mom," he said softly. "You speak English better than anyone I know." She smiled, tired but grateful. "Ah, mi filho, it's not about how well I speak, it's about how they hear me." She clicked the recorder off. "And until they stop hearing something foreign, I must keep learning." Then she tucked the tape player back into her bag and went back to reading, her eyes tracing every word like she was training her voice to become armor. And that night, in the small Toronto apartment surrounded by snow and silence, Keanu realized his mother wasn't just surviving. She was fighting a quiet war every day. With grace, with grit, and without ever asking anyone to fight for her. Weeks passed. Patricia eventually picked up a job as a clerk at a dry cleaner's during the day and took in costume mending work at night. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped them stay afloat. She never missed a shift, never complained, yet every evening after dinner she quietly disappeared to the bathroom, always with the same marked-up pronunciation book and cassette tapes. Some nights, Keanu heard her practicing specific consonants over and over. Think, this, that. Her voice was calm, steady, determined. But once, when she stumbled over the word through, she let out a small, frustrated sigh. Keanu stood in the hallway outside the door, fists clenched. He couldn't understand how a country that had welcomed them could also make someone like her feel unworthy just for sounding different. His mother had survived political upheaval, raised him alone, built her career from scraps, and now she was being measured by syllables? One cold Thursday evening, Patricia came home with a stack of dry cleaning slips in a small envelope. Inside was a thank you card from a customer, an elderly woman from Poland who had trouble with English herself. The card read, "Thank you for speaking to me kindly. I understood every word you said." Keanu read the card twice, then again. Patricia held it like it was something sacred. "She reminded me of my own mother," she said. "She said my voice reminded her of home." That night, for the first time in weeks, Patricia didn't practice with her tapes. Instead, she sat by the window, sipping tea, humming a soft lullaby in Portuguese. Her eyes were peaceful. Keanu didn't disturb her. He just sat nearby, watching the snowfall blanket the city in quiet white. Later, he found her old pronunciation book on the kitchen table. Tucked inside was the thank you card from the Polish woman. On the inside cover of the book, Patricia had written, "Something new," in red pen. It said, "The goal is not to erase myself, the goal is to be understood without changing who I am." Keanu folded the page gently. He didn't say anything, but deep inside, something rooted itself, something that would shape his future. A commitment not just to his mother, but to anyone who'd ever been made to feel small for how they spoke. Years later, when his name would be on posters and billboards and studio marquees, Keanu would still remember those nights. The bathroom light under the door, the sound of slow, careful syllables, and the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to let an accent define her worth. He would never forget. It was a Friday evening at North Toronto Collegiate Institute, and the school auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Parents filled the rows, many dressed in their best jackets and scarves, clutching paper programs that listed their children's names under titles like stage crew, lead role, or lighting design. Keanu, 16 and lanky, waited in the wings, nerves twisting in his stomach, not because he was performing, but because his mother was there. Patricia had taken the night off from her second job just to attend. She always came, no matter how late she got home from the dry cleaners or how exhausted she was from typing scripts all day. She showed up, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with a thermos of hot chocolate. Tonight, she wore her usual long coat and her signature red scarf. She sat in the third row from the front, smiling wide. She was proud, and that meant everything to Keanu. The play was A Midsummer Night's Dream. Keanu had a small role, Theseus, but it wasn't the part that mattered. It was the chance to be someone else's lines, to command attention without having to explain himself. After the final scene, the cast took their bows. Applause thundered. Keanu scanned the crowd and saw Patricia clapping harder than anyone, eyes glistening with emotion. She never missed a curtain call, Backstage, Keanu slipped out of costume and made his way toward the back hallway, where students met their families. On his way, he passed a group of older kids, some juniors, some seniors, laughing and nudging each other near the vending machines. He recognized a few from the soccer team. One of them, a tall boy named Jordan, chuckled a little too loudly. "Did you hear that lady in the front row?" Jordan snorted. "Sounded like she was ordering soup through a foghorn. Bravo! Kai nu!" He exaggerated the vowel, dragging it out in a clumsy imitation of Patricia's Portuguese accent. Another boy chimed in. "Yeah, sounded like Dracula's cousin. So proud of you, my darling boy. What even was that?" Keanu stopped. The hallway seemed to close in around him. The chatter, the laughter, the glow of the vending machine, all of it froze in place. His hands curled into fists by his sides. He didn't move for a second, just stood there, heart thudding, breath caught between rage and restraint. Then he stepped forward. Keanu didn't shout, he didn't shove. He just stepped into the space between the group and the hallway exit, looking straight at Jordan. "That voice," he said calmly, "is the reason I'm even standing here." The group went silent, surprised by his presence. Jordan's smile faltered. "She works 2 jobs. She still finds time to come to every performance. She speaks 5 languages, and yeah, English isn't her first one, but she never lets that stop her from showing up, for me or for herself." Jordan tried to recover. "Hey man, relax. We were just kidding around." Keanu shook his head. "No, you weren't. You were mocking someone who's sacrificed more than you can imagine. You think accents are funny? You think they make someone less intelligent? Try moving to a new country with a kid, no money and no support. Try working night shifts and studying pronunciation books in a tiny apartment bathroom." The others shifted uncomfortably. The laughter was gone. "That voice," Keanu repeated, his own voice, trembling slightly, "taught me how to survive. So yeah, maybe you think it sounds different, but to me, it sounds like strength." Jordan mumbled something under his breath and turned away, walking off down the hall. One by one, the others followed, leaving Keanu alone by the vending machine. He stood still for a moment, breathing hard, heart pounding. A teacher passed by and nodded at him politely, unaware of what had just happened. Keanu didn't follow them. He didn't need to. The words were said, and more importantly, they were heard. Later that evening, Patricia found him near the school's back exit, wrapping his coat tighter as the cold night air crept in. "How was the backstage celebration?" she asked with a warm smile. "Did you get compliments?" Keanu paused for a second, then simply nodded. "Yeah, it was good." She reached up and adjusted his scarf the way she always did. "I'm so proud of you, meu filho." And this time, Keanu didn't feel the need to hide the lump in his throat. He just smiled back, walking beside her to the car, his head held a little higher. From that night on, something changed in Keanu. Until then, he'd kept most of his pain quiet, burying the awkwardness he'd felt whenever someone commented on his mother's voice. He used to wish she didn't talk much in public, not because he wasn't proud of her, but because the world could be so cruel. It wasn't fair, but it was real. Or so he thought. But standing up for her had felt right. Powerful, like reclaiming something. Over the next few months, he began noticing more how people at grocery stores spoke slowly to her, as if she were a child. How receptionists sometimes pretended not to understand her, forcing her to repeat herself, louder, clearer, humiliated. Keanu started to step in when it happened. Nothing loud or showy, just calmly correcting the person, sometimes repeating his mother's words, sometimes saying nothing at all, but standing by her side until they treated her like a human being. She noticed, of course she did, but she never said anything. Patricia had always believed in quiet strength. Still, Keanu could tell she felt seen. One night, after another long shift at the dry cleaners, she came home and found Keanu at the kitchen table, flipping through one of her old pronunciation books. He looked up sheepishly, caught in the act. "You're trying to learn how to speak better than your mama?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. Keanu grinned. "Just trying to understand how hard you've worked." She touched his shoulder gently and said, "I never wanted you to carry my struggles, only my pride." He never forgot those words. Years later, when Keanu gave interviews about his upbringing, he rarely mentioned the taunts or the slights his mother had endured, not out of shame, but out of protection. But every so often, someone would ask him where his calm came from, his stillness, his grounded sense of grace in a chaotic world. And he would answer, "My mother taught me how to listen, and she taught me how to be strong without raising my voice." It all started in that hallway. In the moment he chose to defend what mattered, even when his voice trembled. It was the first time Keanu Reeves ever spoke up for someone he loved, and it would not be the last. The first real audition Keanu ever landed in Los Angeles wasn't glamorous. It was for a supporting role in a made-for-TV movie. Low budget, mediocre script, and the kind of project most actors forgot the minute it aired. But for him, it was everything. A chance. A foot in the door. A way to show he could stand on his own, not just as a name, but as a force. He arrived early, dressed simply. His shoes were worn, his jacket thrifted, but he carried the quiet confidence of someone raised by struggle. He'd memorized the lines, backward and forward, thought through his character's motivations, and practiced in the mirror more times than he'd admit. When he walked into the casting room, he smiled politely and introduced himself. The casting director didn't even look up. "Keanu Reeves," the man said, drawing out the last name like it didn't quite belong in his mouth. "Yes, sir." The director finally looked up. His expression was unreadable. "You've got an interesting look. Where are you from?" "Toronto," Keanu said, bracing for it. The man nodded, tapping his pen against a clipboard. "Your name sounds Hawaiian. And the accent. Your mother didn't grow up in the States, did she?" Keanu hesitated. "No, she's Portuguese. From England originally." The casting director smirked. "Right, figured. I met her once at that producer's party last month. She sounds like she just came off a boat." The room froze around Keanu. He didn't say anything right away. He could feel the heat crawling up the back of his neck, like it always did when he was younger, when people whispered about his mom's voice behind her back. But now the whisper had become a slap, and it was right there, out loud, in front of everyone. The other assistants in the room laughed, softly, nervously. The director didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. "Let's see what you've got," the man continued, flipping to a page in the script. "But try not to bring too much of that sensitive Canadian stuff, okay?" Keanu stared at the page, then slowly closed the script. He stood up. "Actually, I don't think this is the right fit," he said calmly. The room went still again. "You're passing?" the director asked, surprised. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I'll pass." He didn't explain, he didn't shout. He didn't call the man out or storm off in rage. He just left. Outside, the Los Angeles sun was blinding, but Keanu barely noticed. He walked down the studio steps and out onto the sidewalk with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown inside. But his hands were clenched in his pockets, his jaw was tight. He had learned a long time ago that outbursts got remembered in the wrong ways. Silence, on the other hand, could echo louder. He didn't call anyone. He didn't head to the diner where struggling actors swapped rejection stories over coffee. He walked for blocks, past warehouses, palm trees, old theaters turned into supermarkets. He tried to let the noise of the street drown out the voice in his head, repeating the director's words. Like she just came off a boat. It wasn't even original. He'd heard it before, on playgrounds, at border checks, at schools, in whispers, in jokes. Now it had followed him all the way to Hollywood, and somehow hearing it again stung even worse. Because this time, he wasn't the boy watching it happen. He was the man it was directed at. And his mother, who had always walked with dignity through this kind of quiet cruelty, wasn't there to absorb the blow. Later that night, Keanu pulled out a small drawer in his apartment and took out something he hadn't touched in years. It was a yellowed envelope with no writing on it. Inside, folded and worn, was the first headshot his mother had ever taken of him. Patricia had taken it with an old camera she'd borrowed from her neighbor. She had set up a sheet against the living room wall, brushed his hair gently with her fingers, and told him, "Show them your eyes. That's where your truth lives." He ran his fingers along the edge of the photo. It wasn't just an image. It was a moment in time, a reminder that he hadn't made this journey alone. Every step forward in his career had her behind it. Every audition, every callback, every lesson in how to survive with grace, those came from her voice. The one people still laughed at. But he hadn't told anyone what had happened at the audition. Not then. Not for years. He booked another role weeks later, then another. His career slowly took off. People started remembering his name, then praising it. Scripts came in. Cameras rolled. But there were moments when a line in a script made fun of an immigrant, or when someone on set mimicked a foreign voice for laughs. When he would fall quiet. He never joined in, but he never corrected them either. Not yet. Years passed, and with them came fame. Keanu became a household name, but the memories never faded. During interviews, when asked about his upbringing, he always mentioned his mother, always called her brilliant, always used the word strength. But he never mentioned the casting director. He never mentioned the day he walked off set and chose silence over retaliation. Not until now. Back in the Netflix boardroom, the air still hung thick with tension. That snicker, so brief, so small, had cracked something open. It wasn't just about the laugh. It was about everything that laugh represented. Decades of hearing the same judgment wrapped in different voices, dismissal disguised as humor, disrespect delivered in whispers. And Keanu wasn't a quiet 20-year-old anymore. He was a man who had walked away from the set that day, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew his anger would never be understood. Now, he had something more powerful than rage. He had clarity. He had time. And he had a voice that millions would listen to if he chose to speak. That's why he hadn't forgotten. That's why he still remembered how it felt to clench his fists in his pockets and say nothing. That's why he still kept the headshot his mother took. Because that voice, the one they mocked, was the reason he made it this far. It had taught him to be kind when the world wasn't, to listen when others only heard, to walk away without slamming doors. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak. And when he did, it wouldn't be for applause. It would be for the woman who gave him everything and was still expected to speak, better, just to be seen. In that boardroom, as the producer who laughed tried to shrink in his seat, Keanu leaned back. His mother looked at him, puzzled but calm. She had learned long ago to keep her dignity intact when dignity was the only shield. But Keanu saw the flicker behind her eyes. Not sadness, not shame, weariness. And he decided in that exact moment that his silence had lasted long enough. He reached into his jacket, pulled out something small, and laid it on the table. A folded, yellowed photograph. The one she had taken. The one with the truth in his eyes. And with a voice steadier than it had ever been, he began to speak. The entire room turned to listen. And for the first time in years, Keanu Reeves didn't walk away. He leaned in. The soundstage buzzed quietly with pre-production energy, the kind that lingered in the air just before a long shoot. Lighting rigs hummed, fabric swatches were laid out on folding tables, and rows of wardrobe racks lined the hallway like a rainbow army waiting to be assigned to characters. Keanu had stopped by to visit his mother between meetings. Patricia, now a retired costume designer, was consulting one last time on a small indie film, one she'd agreed to help with as a favor to an old colleague. She wasn't in charge, not officially, but everyone respected her. Her hand still moved with the same delicate certainty, pinning fabric and shaping collars, her eyes scanning every detail like a silent artist refining her final canvas. She wore her usual soft gray sweater and a pinned handkerchief on her chest, embroidered with delicate Portuguese flowers her own mother had stitched decades ago. It was small, barely visible beneath her scarf, but to Patricia it was armor. That day, a new intern named Rosa was assigned to assist Patricia. Rosa was barely 20, fresh out of design school and full of nervous energy. Her long black hair was tied in a bun that kept unraveling, and her sketchbook was clutched tight against her chest like a shield. Her Spanish accent curled around her English words gently, like thread spun with care. At first, she moved quickly, eager to impress, but as the day wore on, it became clear something was wrong. Keanu had been sitting off to the side, watching the quiet dance of his mother working. Then he noticed Rosa's shoulders tense. Her eyes flicked toward two production assistants, whispering near the supply shelf. One of them, a guy with sunglasses propped on his head indoors, smirked and said just loud enough to carry, "Why do all the interns sound like they came from a telenovela audition?" The other one chuckled. "I didn't know wardrobe assistant meant ESL practice session." Keanu didn't move. Not yet. Rosa froze mid-magnet. Her hand trembled as she reached for a spool of thread and she dropped it. The sound of it rolling across the concrete floor echoed far louder than it should have. Her face flushed red. She bent to pick it up, but her fingers fumbled. Patricia didn't rush. She walked over, calm as ever, and knelt beside Rosa. She helped her collect the fallen thread without saying a word at first. Then she looked Rosa in the eye, brushed a stray strand of hair back from her forehead, and said softly, "Your voice carries the music of your family. Don't let anyone ever treat that like noise." Rosa blinked hard, trying not to cry. Keanu swallowed, something deep in him tightening. He had seen his mother handle many things in his life, with grace, with silence, with pride. But something about the gentleness in that moment was more powerful than any outburst. She wasn't defending her, she was strengthening her. The two production assistants didn't say another word. One of them quickly turned away and busied himself with cables, pretending not to have noticed the scene he'd caused. The other checked his phone, awkwardly fidgeting. Neither of them offered an apology. They didn't have to. Patricia had already taken back the space, not through confrontation, but through presence. Keanu watched them with a quiet stillness, arms folded across his chest. He didn't need to say anything. His mother's words echoed louder than any rebuke could have. Later that afternoon, during a short break, Keanu walked past the wardrobe room again. The low murmur of voices drifted out into the hallway. He stopped when he heard Rosa speaking softly. "My grandmother used to say something similar," she told Patricia. She said, "Our tongue carries our memory. If they erase it, they erase us." But sometimes I think, maybe I should try to sound more American, just to be taken seriously. Patricia was sitting at the sewing table, adjusting a hemline by hand, the same way she had taught Keanu to do when he was a boy. Her needle paused mid-air. "You know," she said slowly, "when I came to Toronto, I bought a book to reduce my accent. I listened to tapes over and over, practiced syllables until my throat ached, and yet people still looked at me like I was trying too hard, or not trying enough." Rosa sat silently, absorbing every word. Patricia placed the fabric down, then tapped the handkerchief pinned to her chest. "This belonged to my mother. She didn't speak a word of English, but she ran a household, raised 4 children, and knew the names of every herb that could heal a stomach or a broken heart. When people mocked her, she just kept going. I wear this to remember my roots were never the problem." Rosa smiled, her eyes damp. "Thank you." Patricia reached for Rosa's hand and gave it a small squeeze. "Don't lose your voice trying to find someone else's approval. Let them adjust their ears before you adjust your soul. Keanu leaned against the doorframe, unseen for a moment. The same lump in his throat he'd felt as a child in Lisbon, then again in Toronto, now returned. His mother's words had evolved, deepened, but their core never changed. After a moment, he stepped into the room. Rosa looked startled. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," he said gently, "but I think that might have been the best advice I've heard all week." Patricia smiled at him, her eyes filled with something warm and knowing. "You were always listening," she said softly. He nodded. "Still am." Rosa looked between them, slowly realizing she wasn't just being comforted. She was being seen. Truly seen. And it made all the difference. The production resumed, but something had changed. People on set spoke more carefully, not out of fear, but out of newfound awareness. Rosa held her head higher that day. She didn't try to hide her voice anymore when calling out wardrobe notes. And when someone complimented the stitchwork on an actor's jacket, she smiled without deflecting. Patricia had passed something to her, dignity that couldn't be taught in a script. Later that evening, after the wrap, Keanu and Patricia walked together in the parking lot. The California dusk painted the sky in soft purples and fading golds. He carried her bag, as he always had, and she tucked the embroidered handkerchief back into her purse with reverence. "That girl," Patricia said, "reminded me of myself." "I know," Keanu replied. "I've been watching you do that for decades." She gave a small, tired laugh. "Do what?" "Lift people," he said simply, "without ever raising your voice." They reached his car, and as she slid into the passenger seat, Keanu paused. He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you know how many people in Hollywood have asked me why you never gave up? Why you didn't just change your name, your voice, your story?" She raised an eyebrow. "And what do you tell them?" He looked out toward the setting sun. "I tell them, you never needed to change. The world just needed to catch up." Patricia's eyes glistened as she reached over and touched his hand. "You were always a soft boy," she said, her accent curling like warm wind through his memory. And that softness became strength. As they drove home, Keanu glanced in the rearview mirror at the handkerchief now resting on the dashboard. A symbol of resistance not through confrontation, but through unwavering grace. The fabric, aged but strong, stitched by the hands of a woman who never made headlines but shaped generations. He remembered a time in his 20s when he had considered changing his own name, told by agents that Keanu was too unusual, too foreign. Patricia had said nothing then, only left a note on his table. "Your name is the first gift I gave you. Don't return it just because someone doesn't know how to unwrap it." He never brought it up again. That night, back in his quiet home, Keanu sat by a bookshelf lined with scripts and photo albums. From the top drawer, he pulled out an old velvet pouch. Inside it was a second handkerchief, nearly identical to the one his mother wore, stitched by the same woman decades ago. He placed it beside her original, watching them lie side by side. Two matching pieces, passed down through generations, carrying the weight of voices that had never been silenced, only softened for the sake of kindness. And tomorrow, he knew, another voice would need lifting, another Rosa, another child listening from behind a door. And Patricia's words would still be there, waiting. The air inside the Netflix studio conference room felt heavy now, the kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has been said. Keanu's hand was still resting beside his untouched coffee, his fingers relaxed but unmoving. Around him, silence thickened. No one dared to reach for their notes or their phones or even sip from their water. The young producer who had chuckled at Patricia's accent sat frozen across the table, his eyes darting from one face to another in a panicked scan for backup. None came. No one was going to rescue him from the moment he had created. Patricia herself, now seated gently beside Keanu, offered no sign of distress. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap, and her face, though serene, carried an unmistakable quiet power. She didn't look hurt, but she also didn't look away. Keanu slowly turned his head. Just enough. Just enough that everyone saw it. That one motion was all it took. A simple turn of the head, and suddenly every executive, assistant, and intern in the room held their breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hands. Instead, he said something so soft it made people lean in. Let me tell you something about that voice. The room was paralyzed, not by volume but by the sudden, precise shift in atmosphere, like someone had cracked a seal on something sacred. The young producer, Zane, his name tag read, swallowed hard. He looked younger now, smaller, less sure of the confidence that had been so loud only moments ago. Keanu's eyes didn't narrow in anger. They stayed calm. But beneath the calmness was a presence no one could look away from. You laughed, Keanu said, still quiet. Maybe you thought it was harmless. Maybe you've never thought about what it means to carry a voice like hers. Zane's mouth parted slightly as if to defend himself, but he didn't dare speak. No one asked you to understand it, Keanu continued, but the fact that you mocked it tells me more about you than you intended. Patricia remained unmoved. She didn't need to come to her own defense. Not now. Not here. See, Keanu went on, that voice you laughed at? It's the one that told me bedtime stories in Portuguese when we had no money for books. It's the voice that helped me learn my lines when I was 14 and scared to walk into a casting call. It's the voice I heard practicing English over and over again when she thought no one was listening. Zane's hands had disappeared under the table, probably clenched together. Keanu looked at no one else, just him. You think accents are funny. I think they're proof. Proof that someone had the courage to learn a new language, a new country, a new life. That's what you laughed at. The silence after those words felt deeper than before. And Keanu wasn't finished. Keanu let the silence linger just long enough for the weight of his words to settle in every corner of the room. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm, but now laced with something deeper, an old fire that had been burning quietly for years. She never asked for special treatment, he said, his gaze locked on Zane. She didn't complain when people spoke slowly to her like she was stupid. She didn't correct them when they mispronounced her name. She just kept working, kept raising me, kept surviving. Zane shifted in his chair. The confident smirk he wore earlier had vanished. His lips pressed together, and his eyes no longer met Keanu's. You know, Keanu went on, when I was a kid, I used to think her accent was like a song. Not because it was perfect, but because it meant she hadn't given up her roots to fit in. That takes strength. More strength than most people will ever understand. Patricia remained still beside him. If she was emotional, she didn't show it. But in her lap, one hand rested over the other, thumb slowly stroking the edge of her wedding ring. A quiet gesture, one Keanu noticed out of the corner of his eye. Team worked nights at the theater, he said. She stitched costumes for people who would later go on stage and talk about diversity while mocking her pronunciation behind closed doors. He paused. The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. A few producers on the far end of the table shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to break the silence. People assume, Keanu continued, that accents are something to be ashamed of, something to correct. But let me ask you this. When someone speaks with an accent, what does that really mean? No one answered. The question didn't need one. It means they're brave enough to speak in a voice that isn't theirs by birth. It means they chose to be understood in a world that often chooses not to listen. He looked around the room now, not just at Zane, but at everyone. It means they risk misunderstanding, misjudgment, mockery, just to be part of the conversation. The room was frozen. No phones buzzed, No fingers tapped. Even the assistant at the far end had stopped typing mid-keystroke. "And when you mock that," Keanu added, voice low but cutting, "you're not showing your intelligence, you're proving your ignorance." Zane blinked slowly, his shoulders caving ever so slightly. A young assistant beside him looked away, clearly uneasy. Keanu's eyes returned to his coffee for a brief second, then back to Zane. "I was raised by that voice," he said. "It taught me how to listen, how to fight without raising my fists, how to never mistake volume for value." He reached into his blazer, pulling out something small. The room collectively inhaled. Keanu held up the folded piece of fabric between his fingers. It was delicate, worn by time. The edges frayed, just slightly. The colors had faded, but the embroidery was still visible. Small red flowers stitched onto a handkerchief. "This," he said, raising it just enough for the room to see, "was my grandmother's. She sewed it by hand before she passed it to my mother when she left Portugal. I found it once, stuffed in a drawer when I was 10. She told me it was a piece of her voice she didn't want to lose." Zane stared at the handkerchief, his face pale. He looked like a man who had wandered into the middle of a story he didn't deserve to interrupt. "My mother wore this to her first job interview in Toronto," Keanu said. "She wore it when someone told her she should take a speech course before applying again. She didn't wear it to feel proud. She wore it to remind herself not to forget who she was." There wasn't a single sound, not a cough, not a shuffled paper, nothing. Keanu gently set the handkerchief on the table in front of him. "This story we're pitching today," he said slowly, "is about people who have had to bend their tongues just to be heard, who've had to watch others laugh at the very thing that makes them who they are." His gaze turned sharp again. "And if we can't treat one of those voices with respect in this room, then we have no business telling their stories." Zane looked like he might say something, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. His lips trembled slightly before he clamped them shut again. Keanu didn't wait for him to speak. He turned to the rest of the table. "I'm still in. I still believe in this project. But I won't be part of anything that forgets why we're here. That voice you laughed at, that voice raised me. That voice survived things you'll never know. That voice deserves more than silence after a snicker." Patricia remained quiet, her eyes on the handkerchief. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The lead producer swallowed hard and finally found his voice. "Mr. Reeves, I think I speak for all of us when I say, thank you. I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," Keanu replied, his voice soft. "You just needed to listen." He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. Then he looked at Patricia, finally offering her the warmest smile of the day. "Shall we continue?" Keanu's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in the conference room had taken on a weight of its own. Every breath felt louder. Every rustle of clothing sounded intrusive. And Keanu, still seated, didn't move except to fold his hands carefully in front of him. He looked straight ahead, his expression unreadable. But there was something unmistakable in his presence now, something grounded and dangerous, like the calm before a storm. "That voice," he said, his tone low and measured, "raised me." The words landed with precision, cutting through the awkward stillness like a blade through paper. Across the table, the young producer who had laughed earlier, Michael if Keanu remembered correctly, looked as if he wanted to disappear into his chair. His shoulders were hunched now, his eyes fixed on a speck of dust on the table. He didn't speak. No one did. Keanu didn't need their permission. "My mother's voice," he began again, slowly, "has carried more weight than most people will ever understand. Not just words, not just stories, but strength. Real strength. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that endures when nobody claps." He paused, the memory pulling him inward for a moment before he continued. "She used that voice to walk me through multiplication tables by candlelight when the power company shut us off. She used it to calm me down after nightmares about my father leaving, again. And on nights when she was too tired to stand after sewing costumes for a low-budget theater production, she still sang me to sleep in Portuguese, her accent cradling me like a lullaby. The room remained utterly still. Keanu glanced down at his fingers, then back up. The voice hummed when she was in pain, he said. It laughed when she had nothing. It prayed in private when I didn't know she was scared. And when she had to tell me that my baby sister, just weeks old, wasn't coming home from the hospital, she didn't break down. She just said it softly. So I wouldn't. He leaned back ever so slightly in his chair. I've seen people try to ignore her, he said. I've seen people talk over her, correct her, smirk at the way she says certain words. Do you know what she did? He gave the faintest hint of a smile, not from amusement, but from something closer to reverence. He kept talking. The words echoed, weighty and clean. His voice still didn't rise, but the room felt fuller now, like the air had thickened with truth. Keanu's eyes traveled slowly across the table, taking in the faces around him, some flushed, some pained, some quietly ashamed. She buried a child, he said, voice tightening. She'd buried dreams, and still, somehow she carried light in her voice. He stopped, letting that sentence hang, letting it soak into the walls and the people who sat in silence, hearing more in those few words than in the last hour of scripted studio discussion. Because this wasn't performance, this was real. Keanu didn't flinch. His voice remained quiet, but it had taken on a kind of gravity that no one in the room could look away from. When I was 17, he said, I got my first big audition. It was for a television spot. Nothing major, but it paid enough that I thought I could help her out. Just a little. We were barely getting by then. She was cleaning theaters between fittings and still coming home with calluses on her hands. He looked down, exhaled softly. The night before that audition, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch going over the lines, and I remember hearing her in the bathroom. She thought I was asleep. She was standing in front of the mirror, holding a magazine, practicing how to say the word sculpture, over and over. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone reached slowly for a water bottle but didn't unscrew the cap. She didn't have a strong command of certain consonants then. Sculpture gave her trouble, so she broke it down, syllable by syllable, until it sounded more American, like the voices she heard in casting offices. Keanu's jaw clenched for a second. I remember thinking how strange that was. She wasn't even auditioning. She just wanted to help me practice. But she didn't want her voice to be the reason I didn't get the job. He paused. You have to understand what that means. To love someone so much that you try to erase part of yourself for their future. No one dared interrupt, not with a comment, not even with a breath. And that was always her way, Keanu continued. She wouldn't argue with people when they mocked her, wouldn't defend herself. She just absorbed it. Then she'd get up the next day and keep going. He folded his hands again, the movement slow, purposeful. People used to call her soft-spoken, he said. They meant it as a compliment, I think. But they had no idea what that softness carried. It carried decades of struggle, of missing rent, of skipped meals, of hiding fear so her son wouldn't feel it. It carried the loss of her own country, her dreams, her baby daughter, and still, it never cracked. He looked toward the end of the table, where Patricia still sat, her hands now resting in her lap. Her eyes were damp, but she hadn't spoken. Her silence was stronger than words. That voice, Keanu said, sheltered me. It educated me. It shielded me from bitterness. And yes, it embarrassed me when I was young. There were years I wished she sounded like everyone else's mom. But then I grew up, and I realized sounding like everyone else had never been the point. He turned toward the young producer again, not with anger, but with something more cutting, truth wrapped in composure. So when you laugh at her, Keanu said slowly. "You're not just mocking an accent, you're mocking resilience. You're mocking the sound of a woman who raised a boy alone in a country she didn't belong to, who never once asked the world to make space for her. She carved it herself." He let that linger. "And now you're sitting in a room that she helped build. So maybe the voice you laughed at deserves more than your smirk." The room had gone still. No one shuffled papers, no one whispered. Even the overhead hum of the lights seemed quieter. Across from Keanu, the young producer looked down, jaw clenched now for a different reason. Embarrassment had set in, thick and unmistakable. But Keanu wasn't done. He reached into his jacket and pulled something out, carefully folded, like it had been handled 100 times. It was a small, time-worn red scarf, the edges slightly frayed, the color faded from years of sun and tears. "She wore this the day she buried my sister," Keanu said, holding it up just enough for the light to catch the fabric. "Then again when we left Lisbon, and again the day she sat in the back row when I premiered my first film." He folded it gently, placing it back inside his coat. The voice carried me here. Then he turned toward his mother, still seated with dignity at the edge of the room. He gave her a slow nod, not for show, not for applause, but something deeply private between mother and son. Patricia smiled, barely. A smile full of memory, of roads traveled, of sacrifices that never got names. And Keanu whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "I carry it now." Keanu sat forward in his chair, hands resting gently on the edge of the conference table. His voice had softened, but every word landed with purpose. "There's something you need to understand," he said, looking out at the stunned room. "My mother didn't just speak with an accent. She lived with one, woke up with it, fell asleep with it. And every day she used it to survive." The silence was thick now. No one dared interrupt him. Keanu's eyes fixed briefly on the young producer who had laughed earlier, not to shame him, but to hold him still, to make sure he heard every syllable. She came to Canada alone, no husband, 2 kids, 1 suitcase. Her English was strong, but her accent, Portuguese with a lilt of island rhythm, made people assume things, that she wasn't educated, that she didn't belong, that she couldn't contribute. He exhaled slowly, nostrils flaring, for a breath that steadied his tone. "But my mother wasn't just surviving. She was building something. While others doubted her, she made herself useful, translated scripts for student films when no one else could understand the original phrasing, helped actors from immigrant families make sense of lines they'd been too embarrassed to ask about." Keanu glanced toward the edge of the room, as if seeing it all again. He used to sit in the corner of editing rooms and costume trailers. Quiet. Invisible, some would say. But every time someone needed a hand or a solution, she was already 3 steps ahead, fixing hems, redrafting dialogue, hand-sewing torn fabric under a single bulb at midnight, just so some student director could make their deadline. There was a lump in his throat now, but he pushed forward. She did all that without recognition, without titles, without credit rolls, and she did it with an accent that many of those same students laughed at the moment they stepped outside. He paused. A long, meaningful beat. She never called them out, never fought back, never corrected their tone or reminded them what she'd done. She just kept working, sewing silence into strength, stitching power into invisibility. Keanu pulled something from his coat pocket, a small weathered object wrapped in cloth. "These," he said, unwrapping the cloth carefully, "are her sewing scissors. The same pair she used when she stitched together costumes for my first ever stage play. I was 17. She stayed up all night fixing a jacket that didn't fit right because the theater couldn't afford replacements." The scissors glinted in the soft light, dull from use but clearly cherished. "I keep them in my house today," Keanu continued. "Not because they're valuable, but because they remind me that sometimes the sharpest tools aren't the ones people notice. They're the ones that quietly shape everything." His voice dropped to a near whisper, and just like her scissors, her voice shaped mine. Keanu looked down at the scissors in his hand, then carefully wrapped them back in the cloth. His fingers lingered on the fabric, as if holding on to something that had held him together through every storm. "She used to sing sometimes while she worked," he said quietly. "Soft little songs in Portuguese, mostly lullabies her mother taught her. I didn't understand all the words, but I knew what they meant." His eyes lifted again, and this time, they weren't focused on any one person. He was speaking to the whole room now, to every face at that table, and to every version of his younger self who had ever sat in silence. "You see, the thing about growing up around an accent," he said, "is that you begin to hear the world differently. Not just the words, but the way people respond to them. Some people lean in, curious. Others lean back, uncomfortable. And some just laugh." A long pause. My mother knew that laugh. She heard it 100 times in 100 rooms. At school events, in job interviews, at the doctor's office, even from people who thanked her for her work 5 minutes earlier. He shook his head slightly, not in anger, but in quiet recognition of the truth. But she never let it turn her bitter. She used her voice anyway. Not to impress people, not to sound like them, but to help, to teach, to raise her children. He looked over to the corner of the room where Patricia sat, still poised, her hands gently folded in her lap. Her eyes glistened with pride, but also restraint. This was not a woman who enjoyed the spotlight, but it was a woman who had earned every second of it. "She once told me," Keanu said, voice tightening, "when people stop listening to your words, let them hear your heart instead." And I think she did that better than anyone I've ever known. Someone across the table shifted uncomfortably. Another sniffled quietly, caught off guard by the emotion rising like a tide around them. Keanu leaned forward. "I know there are people in this room working on this Immigrant Stories project because they care. And I know some are here because it's marketable. But you can't tell stories like these if you've already decided which voices are worthy of respect." He let that settle. "My mother's voice may sound different to you, but to me, it sounds like courage, like nights spent hungry but hopeful, like strength that never needed to shout." Keanu stood still, but his presence filled the room. The silence had shifted. It was no longer awkward. It was reverent. She once translated an entire shooting script overnight because the director forgot to order one in Portuguese for a costume designer on set. He never thanked her. He barely looked at her. But she stayed and worked 3 more weeks on that film, quietly, carefully, because it wasn't about recognition for her. It was about contribution. His fingers tapped once on the table, not loud, not commanding, just a rhythm, like memory coming in waves. She made costumes out of donated curtains, repaired torn hems with dental floss when we couldn't afford thread. I watched her paint buttons gold with nail polish once because she said, "A king should always shine, even if he's played by a kid in a basement theater." That's the kind of artist she was. He paused, then added, "That's the kind of mother she was." One of the junior producers near the back swallowed hard and looked away. Another executive stared at the floor, unmoving. People like her don't make it into the stories. They're not flashy. They're not loud. But they are the scaffolding. The quiet scaffolding that holds entire lives together, entire projects, entire families. And too often we reduce them to a sound, an accent, a sentence that doesn't land the way we expect. And in that moment, we decide they don't belong in the spotlight. Keanu's voice dropped even softer. But she didn't need the spotlight. She became the light. In the darkest rooms, in the smallest kitchens, in the coldest winters, her voice reminded me I wasn't alone. Her voice was not a flaw. It was a foundation. He took a step back and nodded, as if reaching the end of something sacred. "So when you laugh at that voice or brush past it or try to clean it up for corporate clarity, understand what you're really saying. You're saying that love should sound more American, that sacrifice should come without a trace of struggle, that if someone doesn't sound like you, their story doesn't deserve to be told. Another pause. But I'm here to tell you, that voice, he pointed gently toward Patricia without turning, raised me. And if we're going to tell the stories of people like her, we better start by listening. He sat down slowly, never breaking eye contact with the man who had laughed earlier. No one moved. Not a phone buzzed, not a cough in the air. Just stillness, and the sound of respect returning to the room like a long overdue breath. The room was still frozen, held captive not by noise, but by the sharp stillness of truth. Keanu's voice had fallen silent for a few seconds, but the weight of everything he had already shared lingered in the air like a storm about to break. His eyes were locked on the young producer who had laughed. Once smug, now pale. Everyone else sat breathless, not daring to interrupt what they all sensed was still unfolding. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone had the quiet force of someone who'd spent decades measuring his words carefully. And now, those words were coming not from anger, but from memory, from respect, from truth earned the hard way. "You know what's funny," Keanu said, gaze still steady. "That voice you laughed at? It paid for my first headshots." A soft murmur rippled through the room. No one moved. When I was 18, I had nothing. No agent, no direction. Just a hope and a mother who believed in me when I didn't know how to believe in myself. We were behind on rent. She was stitching ballroom gowns until 2 in the morning. And still, she managed to give me $50 in cash. Folded it into my hand like it was nothing. He turned slightly now, scanning the others at the table. She had just come home from a shift. Her fingers were blistered. I remember how she smelled like thread dust and lavender. She handed me that money and said, "Go let the world see your face, my son." She didn't say it in perfect English, but I heard her love perfectly. He took a beat. That $50 got me my first set of headshots. Those headshots got me my first audition. And the next. And the next. He looked back at the producer, who was now visibly shrinking into his chair. "I wonder, what did your voice do for someone you love? Has it ever worked 3 jobs in a city where no one hears you? Has it ever translated scripts just to keep food on the table? Has it ever paid for someone else's dream?" Silence again. Keanu let the silence linger just long enough. Then he leaned slightly forward, his voice still low but firmer now. "You think mocking someone's accent is harmless? That it's just a laugh?" His eyes swept the room again. "Let me ask you something. How many voices have you tuned out in your life because they didn't sound like your own?" A few people blinked, shifting in their chairs. No one answered. "How many brilliant ideas have you dismissed because they came wrapped in syllables you weren't used to? How many stories have you ignored because they didn't arrive in the perfect cadence of your boardroom vocabulary?" He looked toward a development executive near the end of the table. "You talk about authenticity like it's a buzzword. My mother lived it. She never had to rehearse it." Another pause. "There was a time I thought I had to hide her voice," he confessed, more to himself than anyone. "There was a time I would ask her not to speak too much at events. Not because I was ashamed of her, but because I was afraid of people like you. I was afraid of the flinches, the confused looks, the people who would smile and nod politely, but wouldn't really hear her." He swallowed hard, and I carried that regret with me. The producer across from him looked down at the table, now avoiding Keanu's gaze entirely. Others didn't dare speak. They knew this wasn't just a moment. It was a reckoning. "My mother never asked to be understood," Keanu continued. "She just kept showing up with her imperfect verbs and beautiful vowels and relentless work ethic." He motioned slightly with his hand, recalling something, not in words but in weight. I've seen her talked over, corrected mid-sentence, even complimented in ways that were really just insults with a bow on top. "You speak English so well. Your accent is so charming." As if her entire worth came down to how much she resembled someone else's version of normal. He paused, then asked softly, "Why is it we only celebrate an accent when it's used in a character role or a comedy sketch? Why is it less charming when it's speaking facts or truth or lived experience?" The air thickened. No one had an answer. No one dared try. Keanu let his voice drop to almost a whisper. "That voice built my life. That voice kept me alive. That voice raised me." Keanu's hand drifted to his jacket pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled something out and placed it gently on the table. A black and white photo, faded at the edges. His mother, younger, seated at a sewing table with a costume half-stitched in her lap. Her head was tilted, caught mid-laugh. Behind her, a cluttered wall of fabric and patterned notes. Above all, the look in her eyes. Tired but proud. "That was taken 2 days after she was laughed at during a script meeting," Keanu said quietly. "She was helping a young director rework a wardrobe budget. He interrupted her to ask if she needed a translator. She didn't flinch. She stitched for 5 more hours, then went home and helped me rehearse my monologue for an audition I thought I'd never get." He looked up. "That photo was taken the same week she sold her wedding ring to pay for my first headshots. The room didn't move, and paid for every casting call I ever walked into. It paid for every casting call I ever walked into. It taught me how to keep showing up even when they don't want you. It bought me time, gave me space, and refused to let me give up." He paused, then fixed his eyes on the producer who had laughed. "What did your voice ever do?" he asked, not with anger, but with raw, surgical precision. No reply. Keanu stood, slowly, not dramatic, just steady. He folded the photograph and slid it back into his pocket. "This industry loves to talk about giving voice to the voiceless," he said, glancing toward the Netflix execs. "But too often, the moment someone speaks in a way we don't expect, we stop listening." He gestured toward his mother, who had sat through the entire confrontation with grace, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I don't need your apologies. She doesn't need your approval. What we need is for you to think next time. To ask yourselves, who are you muting just because their voice doesn't echo yours?" He took a breath, letting it settle. Then he said, almost as a closing thought, "There's a reason I brought her here today, because the project we're discussing, the one about immigrant stories, it doesn't belong to me. It starts with her." With that, he nodded to the room and sat back down beside his mother. No one said a word, but everything had changed. The silence in the room after Keanu's words was absolute. His voice, calm yet sharp with conviction, still echoed between the glass panels and modern furniture. No one moved. No one reached for their coffee or glanced at their phones. The producer who had laughed earlier kept his head low, staring at the edge of the conference table like it could somehow erase what had just happened. Across the room, Patricia sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was quiet dignity. Her red scarf, a soft, aged thread from another life in Lisbon, was gently draped over her shoulders. She had said nothing since the laughter that started it all, choosing instead to observe with a kind of grace that came only from surviving far worse. Now, after the room had absorbed Keanu's quiet fire, Patricia shifted slightly. She looked at her son, not seeking approval, not asking permission, just offering him a small, proud smile. Then she turned to the room. Her voice, still marked by the gentle Portuguese melody that had followed her across continents, rose into the silence. "When I was a girl, my father told me the heart speaks before the mouth does," she said softly, "and that the ones who don't listen to your heart will always complain about your words." No one interrupted. She looked around, her eyes calm but piercing. "I came here with nothing but a sewing machine and a baby. No family nearby, no savings, no connections in film, but I had stories in my hands. And I stitched them into every costume, every dress, every scene, because even if I couldn't say the right word the right way, I could make you feel something. A senior executive across the table visibly swallowed. Patricia's voice didn't waver. And yet, people still asked me if I could speak better, as if the meaning of my voice wasn't enough. She paused there, her gaze falling softly on the young producer who had laughed. He hadn't dared to meet her eyes since Keanu had spoken, but now, as if drawn by something he didn't understand, he looked up. Patricia didn't scold him. She simply said, "An accent only matters to someone who can't hear meaning." The words floated, delicate and firm. She adjusted the red scarf on her shoulder. "When I first came to Canada, I thought I needed to change, so I practiced. I tried to pronounce every word like I was born here, but my son..." She turned gently toward Keanu. "My son told me one day, 'Mama, don't erase the music in your voice. That's how I know it's you.'" The room exhaled. Patricia looked back at the table. So, I stopped trying to sound right. I started trying to speak true. And with that, she folded her hands again. The silence returned, not heavy with shame this time, but full of something deeper. Reverence. Reflection. Even the producer who had laughed nodded once, his expression raw, his face pale. Keanu reached out and placed his hand lightly over his mother's. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had said exactly what needed to be heard. No one dared to break the stillness that followed. The young producer, the one whose careless snicker had started everything, sank deeper into his chair. His face had turned a shade paler than the paper in front of him. But this wasn't shame forced upon him. It was awakening. Something had cracked open inside him, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And in its place was understanding. Across the table, a middle-aged woman from marketing quietly wiped her cheek. She wasn't alone. Eyes were glassy all around the room. Some lowered their heads in guilt. Others simply looked at Patricia as if seeing her for the first time. Not as someone's guest, not as a sweet older woman with a soft accent, but as someone who had carried entire generations of sacrifice in silence. The project executive, a veteran at Netflix who had seen every kind of boardroom behavior imaginable, cleared his throat. But the usual scripted polish had slipped away from him. Instead, he leaned forward with visible respect. "Ms. Souza," he said carefully, using her last name as a gesture of honor, "if you'd be open to it, I think we'd be lucky to have you consult on the wardrobe side of this series, especially given what you just shared. I believe your perspective is exactly what we need." Patricia offered him a gentle smile. "Only if you'll let me speak how I speak." He smiled back. "Only if you promise not to speak any other way." Laughter broke through, soft and sincere, cutting the tension like morning sun through fog. The moment wasn't about reparations. It wasn't about a position or correcting one man's mistake. It was about truth, spoken, heard, and absorbed. And for once, no one rushed to the next item on the agenda. No one brushed past the discomfort. Keanu let the moment breathe. Then he nodded toward his mother. "I've spent years learning how to fight in movies. Guns, swords, kung fu, you name it. But my mother? She fought battles that no stunt coordinator could ever choreograph. Her weapon was her dignity, her silence, and when she finally spoke, the world listened." Patricio chuckled softly. "He's exaggerating." "I'm not," Keanu said without missing a beat, "and neither should this room." Then, with grace that matched the quiet power of the last 10 minutes, Patricia stood. "I was never trying to sound American," she said simply. "I was trying to sound like myself. I hope that's enough." And with that, she placed her scarf on the back of the chair, a small gesture that somehow felt ceremonial. It didn't mark the end of the meeting. It marked the beginning of a different conversation. one that had waited too long to be spoken in that room. Keanu stood with her, and slowly, so did everyone else. It wasn't applause. It wasn't performative. It was respect. Earned, quiet, absolute. The silence in the conference room stretched, not out of awkwardness anymore, but from a hush that felt sacred. Everyone seemed suspended in time, still holding on to the final syllables Patricia had spoken. An accent only matters to someone who can't hear meaning. Her words had drawn a line in the air, one that separated the room they had walked into from the room they now sat in. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressing against the polished surface of the table. The younger producer who had laughed no longer met anyone's eyes. His shoulders had dropped. His face was pale, as if he'd only just realized the weight of what he'd done. And for once, the room wasn't watching Keanu Reeves, the movie star. It was listening to Keanu Reeves, the son. He exhaled slowly. "You know," Keanu said, his voice calm but resolute, "this meeting was supposed to be about storytelling, about truth. And somehow, we got reminded what truth actually sounds like." The executive producer nodded silently across the table. Her pen had been resting on her notepad for minutes, unmoving, as if the moment itself was more important than the notes. Keanu turned his gaze toward the studio rep in charge of the project's structure. "Can I see the treatment again?" he asked. The studio rep, flustered, handed him a copy. Keanu flipped through it quietly, scanning the highlighted notes, the revisions, the goals. The pages were crisp, methodical, efficient, safe. Page after page, notes outlined the plan for capturing immigrant stories, but with an editorial filter. A dialect coach was listed as mandatory support. Accent smoothing was mentioned twice. Translation notes were in bold font. The project pitch emphasized clarity and relatability to general Western audiences. He closed the binder gently. Then he looked up. "We're not doing this like that." The room blinked as one. "Excuse me?" the studio rep said. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're not adjusting people's voices to fit comfort zones," he said. "We're not polishing away the exact thing that gives these stories meaning. If someone speaks with the rhythm of Lagos, or the softness of Lisbon, or the edge of Istanbul, they stay that way. That's the strength. The sound is the truth." There was a long beat of silence before someone at the far end of the table finally asked, "Then, what are we doing?" Keanu turned to Patricia, who smiled, then looked back at the team. "We're going to let people speak," Keanu said, "and we're going to listen. Not correct, not rephrase, not dub, just listen. And if that makes someone uncomfortable, that's a sign we're telling the right story." The words settled like a stone in still water, creating quiet ripples that reached every face in the room. Someone coughed gently. A younger assistant looked up from her laptop and blinked, visibly moved. Patricia sat tall beside her son, her expression calm but quietly fierce. Her embroidered handkerchief peeked out from her sleeve, still pinned with care. Across the table, the executive producer, who had stayed silent for most of the meeting, leaned in. Her voice was soft but certain. "You're right," she said. "We've spent months chasing the idea of representation without asking who we're truly representing." She looked down at the binder in front of her. "These edits, these adjustments, they're more about control than clarity. We've been so focused on how stories sound, we forgot why they matter." Keanu nodded, but he wasn't looking for agreement. He was protecting something now. An invisible thread that had tied the entire room to something real again. He turned back to the project lead. "Let's strip it down. Take the filters off. No accent reduction, no scripted translations. Let each person speak their truth in their own voice. Let us hear the cracks, the rhythm, the beauty in how they've survived." The producer, who had laughed earlier, remained silent, head lowered. He wasn't defensive anymore. He looked humbled. From the back of the room, one of the cultural consultants raised her hand slowly. "We've been sitting on dozens of interviews," she said. "Real people, real stories. Most of them didn't make it into the first cut because their English was too hard to follow." "Bring them back," Keanu replied. "All of them." The room nodded slowly. The weight of the earlier tension was shifting, melting into something else. Momentum. Keanu turned toward the whiteboard on the far wall and uncapped a marker. In clean, even handwriting, he wrote, "One sentence at the top. The strength is in the sound." Then he stepped aside, letting the words speak for themselves. He looked over at Patricia. She gave a small nod, eyes shimmering. It was no longer just a meeting. It was a new beginning. After Keanu finished writing on the whiteboard, no one spoke for several seconds. A stillness settled over the room, but it wasn't the kind that came from tension anymore. It came from reflection. Then the executive producer stood. She crossed the room, read the sentence again, "The strength is in the sound," and underlined it twice. "That's the new creative North Star," she said. "It stays at the top of every draft, every pitch, every edit meeting." Someone clapped softly, then another. One of the junior producers leaned forward, visibly emotional. "When my grandmother first came here from Haiti," she said, "she used to sing to us in Creole every night. I never realized how much shame she carried about her accent until I got older. But it never occurred to me that her voice had value because of its difference." Patricia smiled gently, eyes on the young woman. "Your grandmother's voice was a gift," she said. "Every syllable it carried held the weight of sacrifice." The young woman nodded, wiping a tear. Across the table, a new project manager began typing feverishly. "I'll update the creative document right now. Patricia's quote is going in as our statement of purpose. No more cleanup notes, no more suggested voice adjustments, just truth." Keanu watched it all unfold, but said very little now. The momentum had shifted. The people in the room weren't just reacting, they were responding. Owning it, building something real. Patricia's voice, so often dismissed or talked over, had just recentered an entire production. Not by raising its volume, but by refusing to shrink. The young man who had laughed earlier slowly raised his hand. Eyes downcast, voice quiet. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize what I was doing, but now I do. I've been judging voices my whole life, thinking I was being funny. I was being ignorant." Patricia nodded. "Now you know. That's how change begins." The creative director cleared his throat, his voice gruff but sincere. "Let's do what this story set out to do from the start. Not a polished portrait of immigration, but a raw chorus of real voices, accents and all." The meeting began to hum with a new energy. Laptops opened, notebooks flipped, conversations sparked. And all the while, at the center of it, Patricia sat quietly next to her son, her hand still resting on the table, just inches from his. She didn't need to say another word. The world was finally listening. The meeting had ended, but the silence in the hallway afterward was louder than any speech. The young producer, Marcus Lane, stood by the glass wall, his reflection fractured by the sunlight slicing through it. He held his phone in both hands, staring at the blank screen, the weight of shame finally breaking through the arrogance that had once seemed so secure. Keanu had left the room without another word. Patricia had nodded to the others with quiet grace, her shoulders still proud. No bitterness, just truth. But Marcus wasn't okay. He had always thought of himself as progressive, an ally, someone who understood. He'd posted about immigrant rights, liked videos about cultural heritage, shared articles on inclusion. Yet in a single laugh, in a single mocking smirk, he had betrayed something uglier, buried beneath that performance. It wasn't just what he did, it was when and to whom. A room full of artists, a project about immigrants, and a woman who had survived so much more than he could even comprehend. He opened his notes app and began to type. Not for show, not for PR, for her. I want to apologize to Patricia and to everyone in that room. My laugh was ignorant, my silence afterward even more so. He paused, breathed deeply, and continued. I laughed at someone's voice without asking myself where that voice had come from. I didn't see the strength in her words. I didn't see her. I just heard difference and made it a joke. That wasn't funny. It was cruel. I am sorry. He posted it to his personal social media page with one simple caption. We don't need accent reduction. We need bias reduction. Accent pride. The post sat there for a while, mostly unnoticed. But then one of the script consultants from the meeting, a Nigerian-American writer named Tolu, reshared it with a comment. This is how accountability sounds. Thank you, Marcus. My mother has lived with this same judgment for 40 years. Then someone else from the meeting added, I didn't speak up in that room, but I heard what Keanu said. I've heard it my whole life, from my abuela, from my uncle who fled Vietnam, from my dad who learned English at 50. Accent pride. The hashtag began to catch on, not because of any marketing push, but because it gave people a phrase for something they'd felt for a long time and never had the words for. A simple declaration of dignity. Accent pride. By the end of the week, the Accent Pride campaign had grown into something much bigger than any of them could have anticipated. It wasn't just actors or directors speaking up now. It was nurses, teachers, janitors, soldiers, taxi drivers, and grandmothers with trembling hands. People from every walk of life began sharing recordings of their loved ones' voices, some thick with heritage, others soft with time. In one clip, a woman from Detroit recorded her Korean father reading her a bedtime story, his voice stilted but sweet, mispronouncing nearly every third word. The caption read, "This voice taught me to love books." In another, a young boy in Miami held up a photo of his abuela. She couldn't say my name without rolling the R, but she said it with pride. What started as a reaction to a moment of casual cruelty had become a movement. Patricia's quiet sentence, "An accent only matters to someone who can't hear meaning," had taken on a life of its own. It appeared on posters in classrooms, on murals in immigrant neighborhoods, on coffee mugs and screensavers. It had been quoted on CNN, written into op-eds, and used to open diversity seminars from Los Angeles to London. But Patricia stayed out of the spotlight, always had, always would. She never gave interviews, never made a statement. While the world quoted her, she returned to her quiet rhythm, pinning hems, threading needles, adjusting seams. She kept a copy of the quote taped to the side of her sewing table, next to a faded Polaroid of Keanu as a child, grinning with 2 front teeth missing. In one photo that made the rounds quietly online, Patricia stood beside Keanu on the set of a small indie film, unnoticed by the press. She wore her usual scarf and a new pin, one someone had mailed her from Minnesota. It simply read, "Her voice, her story." Some people shared that photo like a prayer. In a world that often prized polished speech, practiced eloquence, and perfectly neutral diction, Patricia had reminded them all of a deeper truth, that meaning doesn't always arrive in perfect form, that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that carry the weight of generations, of displacement, of adaptation, that sometimes dignity speaks with an accent. And sometimes the most lasting legacy begins not with a speech, but with a whisper. Not with applause, but with a single look. And not with a flawless voice, but with one that dared to be different. The first clip went viral less than 12 hours after the meeting ended. A cell phone video, grainy and shot from the back of the room, captured the exact moment Keanu Reeves stood up, looked directly at the young producer, and said, "That voice raised me." Those 5 words were enough. People around the world paused, rewound, played it again. At first, it was shared among actors, costume crews, and Netflix interns. Then it hit X, formerly Twitter, then TikTok, then morning shows. Hashtags bloomed overnight. But one stood out among the noise. Accent pride. A student in London posted, "I watched Keanu defend his mom and realized, I've been trying to hide my dad's Colombian accent for years. Never again. Accent pride." In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a teenager named Tiago recorded a 30-second video sitting in his school uniform, speaking directly into the camera with trembling honesty. "When I moved here, I practiced how to sound more normal. I stopped speaking Portuguese around friends, but today I watch Keanu Reeves say his mother's accent was music, and now I just want to speak like my mother. I'm not ashamed anymore. Accent pride." The video had 2.8 million views by midnight. In the days that followed, something strange and beautiful began to happen. Patricia, now back home and tending to her small herb garden, was unaware at first. It was Keanu's assistant who showed her the trending tag and the growing wall of video tributes, each featuring someone speaking proudly in their natural accent: Mexican, Greek, Nigerian, Vietnamese, and dozens more. Patricia blinked at the screen, stunned. Her own words, spoken so gently and simply in that meeting, had become a movement. An influencer in Mumbai had stitched a clip of Patricia saying, "An accent only matters to someone who can't hear meaning," alongside a video of her own mother reading poetry in Marathi. In her caption, she wrote, "I've been trying to sound professional for so long I forgot what pride sounded like. Thank you, Safara Patricia." Accent pride. Within a week, Patricia began receiving letters. Some arrived by email, others as physical envelopes forwarded through Keanu's agent. They came from children of immigrants, from ESL teachers, from elderly women who had stopped speaking in public because people didn't understand them. One card stood out. A young woman had written in careful cursive, "Dear Patricia, when my son asked me why I don't talk much at school pickup, I told him it was because people always ask me to repeat myself. But now I showed him your video and he said, 'Mama, I like how you talk. It sounds like home. You helped me hear my voice again. Thank you.'" Patricia read that one 3 times, then placed it on her dresser next to the picture of Keanu as a boy. It wasn't just individuals who responded. Schools began incorporating accent awareness sessions into their diversity programming. A London theatre group launched a campaign encouraging actors to audition in their natural voices. Podcasts invited guests to speak without Americanizing their tone. Corporate offices put up signs that read, "Every voice belongs." And somewhere in Brazil, a teenage boy named Mateus did something that made his mother cry, in the best way. He had always spoken Portuguese at home and English with friends, but he'd spent years trying to lose his mother's soft, lilting accent from his own speech, so no one would laugh when he said think as tink or birthday as bird day. It had worked. No one laughed anymore. But he felt empty. Then he watched the video of Keanu Reeves talking about his mother. The part that hit him the hardest was when Keanu said, "She buried a child, buried dreams, and still carried light in her voice." Mateus thought about his own mother, who had crossed oceans for him. The next day, he recorded a short video. It was simple. No filters, no music, just him and a few Portuguese sentences, spoken slowly, clearly, without apology. In the caption, he wrote, "I used to be ashamed, now I speak like my mother." That clip reached over 10 million views in 2 days. It was shared by celebrities, teachers, and immigrant organizations across the globe. And when Patricia saw it, her hand trembling just slightly as she adjusted her glasses, she whispered something Keanu would later repeat on stage. "Sometimes the voice that carries the most weight," she said, "is the one we were once told to hide." The ripple had become a wave, and it hadn't come from shouting. It had come from dignity. The envelope was small, folded twice, and came in a stack of fan mail forwarded to Keanu by his agent. He didn't usually read them right away. Most went into a box in his office, a box he called Hearts and Echoes. But something about this envelope made him pause. It wasn't the handwriting or the scent of the paper. It was the childish scrawl on the back. "For Mr. Keanu Reeves, please don't laugh at my spelling." He opened it gently, carefully unfolding the lined notebook paper. Inside was a letter in purple marker, dotted with stars and hearts. "Dear Mr. Reeves, my name is Sophia. I'm 9 years old and I live in Queens with my mom and my little brother. My teacher said my mom should work on her accent because it's hard to understand. I didn't like that. It made me sad. My mom is the bravest person I know. She works at a bakery all night and then reads me books in the morning. I think her voice is beautiful. It sounds like warm toast." Keanu blinked, holding the page steady in his hand. The words weren't perfect, but the message was. A child trying to hold on to pride while the world around her whispered shame. The letter continued, "I saw your video with your mom. When you said her voice raised you, I cried a little. It made me feel not alone. I showed the video to my teacher. She said she didn't realize how it could feel bad to hear that. She told the class she was sorry. I hugged my mom that night and told her her voice is strong, like yours said." Keanu sat still for a long time. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint breeze pushing against the windows. He reread the final lines, again and again. "Thank you for making me proud of how we talk. Now I speak like my mom on purpose. Love, Sophia." He reached for the drawer where Patricia's scarf was folded neatly beside his notebooks. It was the same red scarf she wore to the bank in Lisbon, to the apartment showings in Toronto, to Keanu's first movie premiere when no one knew who he was. The scarf was faded now, but its thread was strong. With both hands, Keanu carefully folded Sophia's letter and tucked it into one of the inside folds of the scarf. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was an inheritance, passed down from one brave voice to another. Later that afternoon, Keanu found himself standing in his mother's sunlit kitchen. Patricia had just made tea, her hands still steady, still graceful, still marked by decades of needlework, bills, and folded scripts. She placed a small porcelain cup in front of him, the kind with delicate gold trim that she brought from Lisbon all those years ago. She didn't say much, but she saw the folded scarf in his hands. He unfolded it gently, revealing Sophia's letter. Patricia read it silently, eyes glistening but lips calm. When she looked up, she smiled. "She will grow up strong," she said. "She already is." Keanu nodded. "She reminded me of you." Patricia touched the edge of the scarf, her fingers lingering on the familiar fabric. "We all leave something behind with our voices," she said. "We just never know when someone will finally hear it." That evening, Keanu posted Sophia's letter on his personal blog. Not for fame, not for attention, just to amplify a voice that deserved to be heard. He wrote a short caption. "To the next Sophia, speak like your mother. That's where the music lives." The post went viral within hours. Thousands of replies came in, many from young children or first-generation immigrants. A boy in Chicago said his classmates used to laugh at his mom's Punjabi phrases, but now he plays recordings of her voice during show and tell. A girl in New Zealand shared a video of her grandmother reciting poetry in Mandarin. A refugee teen from Greece uploaded a piano composition titled Accent. The description read, "My mother's lullaby in notes instead of words." Every story was a spark, and together they lit a fire. People began tagging their videos with a new hashtag, Voice Like My Mother. Teachers incorporated it into lessons. Parents read their children bedtime stories in their native tongues with pride. Multinational companies sent out internal memos encouraging leaders to listen more carefully in meetings, to seek meaning, not grammar. Across platforms, voices that once felt out of place were now lifted, celebrated, shared. It was Patricia who noticed the shift first. She got letters, hundreds, from Portugal, Brazil, Vietnam, Poland, and places Keanu had never even heard of. Some came handwritten on paper, some printed from internet cafes, some translated by grandchildren and tucked into envelopes with family photos. They called her Tia Patricia, Mãe dos Fortes, the mother of strong voices. She read them slowly, some aloud, some just to herself. But for every one, she whispered a thank you. One night, she found Keanu sitting at her sewing table holding her old scissors, the ones she used to cut patterns late into the night. He looked at them like relics from another life. Patricia smiled. "They still cut fabric," she said. "But now, we're cutting different shapes. Bigger ones." Keanu turned, eyes soft. "You did this." Patricia shook her head. "We did this." A few days later, Keanu stood on a small stage at a youth storytelling event in Brooklyn. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He was just the guest speaker, invited by a 12-year-old named Sophia, who wanted him to meet her mother. After her daughter's story, a woman with soft curls and tired eyes stepped up shyly. Her accent was thick, musical, undeniably Brazilian. She apologized nervously before speaking, but Keanu gently shook his head. "You don't need to say sorry for how you speak," he said. "You should be proud of it. Your daughter is." She blinked back tears, then held out her hand. Keanu took it. Back home that evening, he reached for the red scarf again. It was older now, a little faded, but full of meaning. He folded Sophia's thank you note and tucked it into one corner, smoothing the fabric gently with his palm. Then he placed it beside his mother's old scissors and whispered to the empty room, "So they'll always stay together." Outside, the city moved fast, full of noise and ambition. But inside that home, surrounded by memory and meaning, the past and future were stitched tightly together by a voice, a thread, and a story still unfolding. The sun had nearly vanished below the horizon, leaving a soft amber glow across the quiet shoreline. Keanu and Patricia walked slowly, side by side, their footprints the only ones etched in the sand behind them. The ocean moved with a gentle rhythm, its steady hush offering a kind of peace that neither of them had expected to feel after the week they'd just lived. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of decades of battles, fought and forgiven, full of unspoken words that no longer needed saying. Patricia's scarf fluttered faintly in the sea breeze, its red threads catching the last light like a banner of memory and strength. Keanu finally broke the silence. "Does it still hurt?" he asked softly, glancing down at her, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Patricia looked out at the endless water. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile only women who've walked through fire know how to give. Quiet, knowing, unbent. "Less," she replied. "Now that people are listening." Keanu nodded, his throat tightening. He remembered the days when she used to stand outside school plays, waiting with a nervous smile, afraid she might embarrass him with her voice. She never knew that he'd always stood taller when he saw her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded square of fabric. Her mother's old handkerchief, the one with the tiny embroidered flowers. Inside it was tucked a letter, the one from the girl in Queens, the one who had stood up for her mother's voice after watching his speech. Patricia noticed. She didn't say anything. She just placed her hand over his and squeezed. Behind them, the waves erased their footsteps, but not the path they had walked. As they continued walking, the sky deepened into lavender and blue. The tide came closer, brushing the sand just a little nearer with every breath of the ocean. Keanu glanced at his mother again, and for a moment he saw not the woman who raised him, but the little girl she once was. The immigrant child who had to learn a new language in a world that made her feel small. The teenager who worked in sewing shops to help her family survive. The mother who stitched dreams into costumes for others while keeping none for herself. He stopped walking and looked out toward the sea. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never told you this, but there were times I didn't know if I was going to make it. There were days when I had no auditions, no money, and no answers. But I could always hear your voice in my head, and it didn't matter what it sounded like to the world. It sounded like home." Patricia reached up and gently touched his cheek, her eyes glassy with emotion. "You made it, Keanu," she said. "And now, so many others will too." Far away, the world was still buzzing. More letters, more stories, more voices rising. Teachers rethinking how they spoke to their students. Children recording videos of their parents proudly reading bedtime stories in Hindi, Arabic, Vietnamese, and Spanish. Hashtags were still trending. Campaigns were still growing. But here, on this beach, there was just a mother and her son. Keanu took a deep breath and turned toward the camera crew waiting at a respectful distance. They were wrapping up a short documentary about the campaign, how it started with a single laugh in a meeting and became something that reached across continents. He nodded to them, signaling they could roll the final shot. One simple line. One final reflection. Keanu looked out into the setting sun and spoke with quiet clarity. If someone ever believed in your voice when others didn't, share their name in the comments. Let their voice echo here. Then he stepped aside and let the camera capture the ocean, its steady waves a symbol of something ancient, enduring, and endlessly returning. Later that night, Patricia would sit in her small living room, surrounded by hundreds of letters and messages sent from strangers around the world. She would hold each one like a treasure, tears slipping down her cheeks as she read the kind words written in dozens of accents. And Keanu, still wearing her scarf folded in his jacket pocket, would whisper to himself before bed, "Your voice carried me. Now it carries the world." If you believe every voice deserves respect, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let kindness speak louder than judgment. Let every accent be a song.